Hey, welcome everybody to Stockholm Free World Forum. My name is Oscar Jonsson. I am director here. I am incredibly delighted to welcome Matt Ferchen, who is a scholar at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center, where he's running their China and the Developing World program. Matt has, amongst other things, a PhD from Cornell, and he can tell you more about what he's writing on, and you can find his work at Carnegie. Before getting away, I would just start flagging up another thing. We got two more things we got cooking next week. And Monday, we also have, we're continuing our China focus. We have two of Australia's leading cyber experts focusing on Huawei and Chinese cyber espionage, but also offensive cyber capabilities. And then on Friday, we have Anders Åslund, which probably don't require that much introduction, but he's an economist who worked in Russia for decades, and he's launching his book, Putin's Kleptocracy, on next Friday. Enough of that. Matt here is going to give us an introduction on China's international investments and the influence derived therefrom. He'll talk around 25 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for a common discussion here. So warm welcome, Matt, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks for the kind introduction, Oscar, and very glad to be here today to talk to you all, and thanks for showing up. This is what I'm going to talk about really is when we get to these issues of some of the investment screening topics, but I'm going to get there by way of talking about what I see as a sort of mirrored set of discussions on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of a reassessment of the relationship with China. And I think this is important background because I don't think we would be here talking about questions of investment and influence and screening processes and the challenges of Huawei and 5G and all of these things if it weren't for some of these bigger processes at play, which have sort of brought us here. And again, I think there is some sense of a mirroring. I play around a little bit with the idea of consensus in terms of this need for a pushback, and a lot of that has centered on themes like China now, among other things, being a systemic rival in the European Commission assessment, or on the US side, a strategic competitor. So this idea that there's something that has changed in the framing of relations with China, and again, on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm going to start with that and sort of where I see this pushback, the forces behind that, and the logic of it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how that consensus or mirroring is potentially less deep and less consensual, and where there's maybe, even if there's agreement on some of the problems or challenges, there's less so on what to do about it side of things. So I'll look at that a little bit, and that'll lead me into more of this discussion about what China is looking to do from what I understand in Europe, and this questions then related to investment screening and what we make of that. So let me begin with this assessment of what I see happening in the reappraisal, again, on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of thinking about China. And I purposely am not going to go into too much detail about which side I'm talking about, because I think you'll see some echoes of this in lots of different places, but also but that's not quite the story here or there. But let me get into it, and we can talk about some of those differences later. So who and what is really driving this reassessment? I see 5 categories. First is the business communities, who are concerned about things like market access, technology transfer, intellectual property rights at a sort of specific level, and then broader questions about China's industrial policy, and often that gets encapsulated in China's 2025 strategy for a variety of sectors, often in high-tech areas where China has set out to try to become a global player, if not dominant. So the business community has played a major role in backing or pushing for a different set of policies, especially in the United States, but I think many of these issues are shared throughout Europe as well and in some other places. Next, national security interests and concerns. Much of this is focused on issues like strategic or critical technology or infrastructure, and those a lot of very specific issues. And then more broadly, the question of what is often now framed as China's geo-economic strategies. So this way in which China's efforts through programs like the Belt and Road Initiative are not simply commercial, but also have a geostrategic component whereby China may be seeking to gain economic, political, or other kinds of influence as a result of these. So a kind of skepticism that what China is doing in terms of investment or finance abroad isn't just commercial, that there are these other elements. And I would say a lot of the action that we see right now in terms of the rethinking and sort of pushback against China, including in investment screening, is at this intersection of business and national security. Three other categories that I think also are at play: human rights concerns. Some of these are also on the tech side. So the way in which the Chinese government uses surveillance technology for society, for minority policies, especially in Xinjiang, a general sense of sort of collecting of information about Chinese citizens to maintain or deepen control of the Chinese government and Communist Party over all aspects of life in China. So human rights concerns on all of these different issues, and again, much of it, if there's a regional focus on Xinjiang. Academic communities, and I think this one doesn't probably get as much focus as others sometimes, but I think there has been, broadly speaking, a changing of tone in many academic communities that were broadly for more engagement than less engagement, more cooperation with China, have a growing sense of a set of concerns. Some of that includes visas, access to China, a sense that if they write about or say the wrong things, that they may not be able to continue to do their research, worries about academic journals that are censoring themselves for Chinese markets or because of Chinese demands, concerns about academic freedom and the space for discussion in Chinese universities and in Chinese academia, or the way in which that's finding its way also into Chinese student groups or students who are studying abroad in the United States and in Europe, and worries about whether or not Chinese embassies are putting pressure on students to not have certain discussions or to push back against discussions, let's say, on Tibet or a variety of different topics. And then media. So media certainly amplifies almost all of these issues and picks up on some of the most extreme ones, but certainly I think you'd find all of these issues expressed and amplified in the media. Long-standing concerns about treatment of journalists in China. Never been easy. Not sure how much that is changed, but it's certainly not getting any easier now. And then we see a couple of prominent former journalists who now are key players in some of this pushback against China. So Matt Pottinger in the case of the United States, and John Garneau in the case of Australia. A couple of people who spent time on the ground doing work, we'll say the Wall Street Journal or Australian publications, and know a lot about sort of the challenges faced by journalists, but also just a lot about what is happening in China on especially economic and security issues. So we've got these 5 broad categories. I think that the nature of the problems that they identify broadly fall into 2 categories. The first of them is a sense that reform, especially economic reform, but also political reform, or the possibility of political reform in China in a sort of in the direction of more liberalization, has either stalled or gone into reverse. So on the economic side of things, all these issues, market access, technology transfer, intellectual property rights, those were out there before. These are longstanding concerns. Some of them were sort of built into WTO accession, and then there's a sense that China's just never really gone as far as it could with these. So that's one where you saw these concerns for a long time. There was hope that you'd get more opening, more liberalization, and there's a sense that that process has stalled or gone into reverse. And I think on the deterioration side of things, people point to the way in which Xi Jinping has decided to put more emphasis on the importance of, say, state-owned enterprises. So instead of reducing their role in the economy, it seems to be expanding. They play a really important role in outbound foreign direct investment and financing. And just a general sense that China is kind of recommitted to industrial policy and planning of the type we see in that 2025 report in a way that really shows that China is no longer going down the path of these reforms and liberalization that it may have been before. So that much of that is behind some of the concerns, especially on the business side, but also on the national security side. And then if those are sort of areas that are stalled or going in reverse, there are others that are seen as new and detrimental, harmful either to China or to others in the world. And the first of these is really focused on the domestic scene in China. So Xi Jinping taking over the reins of control, seeming with no successor in mind, and going against the norms of the 10-year succession platform in China. So basically being leader for life, potentially. And then the sort of intrusion of the Chinese Communist Party into all aspects of Chinese society, business, in a way that maybe had been limited before, but now this is something that Xi Jinping himself emphasizes and the party is emphasizing. And then on the foreign policy front, this idea of China as being newly assertive, and we see this language being used and concerns focused on the military sense in South China Sea for quite a long time, but on this sort of geoeconomics or economic statecraft side of things on the Belt and Road. That China, especially since 2010 and after the financial crisis, has really sort of changed its attitude, and then under Xi Jinping just wants to play a new and different and more assertive role in the world. Some of the solutions and remedies that we see then as a response to this very much at play in the trade discussions, trade war with the United States and China. So we see obviously the tariffs, but we also see controls on technology exports, critical security related export controls, and then this process of investment screening. So those are definitely part of the sort of defensive mode that is part of what's being called for in terms of reaction to China based on all these concerns. And then preparing of publics for a very different kind of relationship with China. I think we see at least in the United States, the Mike Pence speech last October was very much about this and sort of trying to explain to the American public why the US was rethinking this relationship. Let me talk a little bit, if that's all kind of adding up to, maybe a consensus or at least mirrored discussions where there are shared sets of concerns on both sides of the Atlantic. There are a number of reasons where I would look to see maybe some cracks in this consensus, some of which are maybe more built in and some of which are maybe longer term. I think the fundamental tension behind all of this and why we may expect a shallowness or a brittleness to some of this consensus is just the very logic of cooperation and engagement versus all of these reasons for pushing back. And maybe the easiest one of these to understand is just the way in which businesses want to do more business, not less business with China, whether that's in the Chinese market, so market access. What they're asking for is a fair playing field, more market access, less Chinese restrictions on certain sectors. So businesses want to do more business, or in terms of Chinese investment or potentially of financing in Europe, in the United States, and other places, that for the most part, there's a desire for especially local leaders who want to see more employment opportunities, more investment in their local area. They want more rather than less investment. Businesses who see opportunities where Chinese firms are out in the world buying firms and technologies, oftentimes that's seen as a major incentive and calculation in the logic of cooperation. And all of that is just fundamentally at odds with this broader set of pushbacks and concerns. And I think that lies behind, how far we will see how long can the tariff negotiations last? Where will they end up? Because all these different groups who want to sell, say, their soybeans to China and the United States or others, how long will they be on board with this pushback in the way that it's lasting now? I think some trends to watch for, at least on the U.S. side in this consensus. We're already in it, but it's going to pick up steam. The 2020 election cycle, so both at the presidential level and then at the congressional level, I think you're going to see some, at the very least, differentiation among politicians about how they view the China question and the United States' role in the world. Some of that, I think, will bring back some of the policies and principles which have been jettisoned by the current administration. So questions of multilateral efforts, the transatlantic relationship, who are America's allies, how should they be dealt with, questions of global governance. I think the tone as it relates to China is going to continue to be rather hawkish, but I think there may be very different approaches to how you may respond to this set of concerns, even while you're sort of portraying yourself as being sufficiently vigilant about China. So I think there may be quite different approaches that matter a lot for, say, Sweden or Europe, the EU in general, when it comes to these are difficult times in the transatlantic relationship and in this question of America's approach to allies in Europe and in Asia, and we may see some different discussions about that going forward. And then I think in the EU itself, we have both this new connectivity platform and the EU screening process for investments, and both of these are sort of out there now they've been agreed upon, but there's a lot of work to do to put them actually in place. And I think there'll be a lot of, if these are examples of the EU actually acting as the EU on these foreign policy issues, the real question is still going to be how those are put into place and how different countries interpret their own interests as it relates to, say, Eurasian connectivity in the European response to the Belt and Road, and then this question of defensive measures in terms of Chinese investment and influence. Let me go into a little bit more then about sort of where I see China's industrial policy and its relationship to screening processes here in Europe. The first issue is kind of asking what is it that China wants in Europe. I think fundamentally it still wants to have market access, and to the extent that it sees different kinds of markets available, certainly more technology available, high-tech opportunities for mergers and acquisitions, and understanding how companies are run and what kind of technology they're using. We see certainly some of that here in Sweden. We see it in Germany. We see it other places in Northern and Western Europe. Huge investments, by far the most in the UK still, and much of that also focused on these sorts of technology issues. So we have that and as one plank, and then another with a sort of different geographic focus, which is more of the type of infrastructure investment and roads and ports and dams. We see more of that in some of Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. So we see Italy, some of the discussion about the Belt and Road MOU, maybe about ports and other kinds of BRI type deals. Certainly the port in Greece, things like dams in Portugal. So we see some differentiation a bit in terms of what China's looking at economically in the region. And in terms broadly of industrial policy in China and what that means for Europe, I think there is a real commitment still on the Chinese side to this 2025 platform, to the sectors and the technology areas that China has designated as important. I don't think that is going to change, despite the fact that they've toned down the rhetoric and in response to U.S. demands and others. I think that's kind of a short-term tactical maneuver to demonstrate some goodwill, but I don't see, at least for right now, any fundamental move away from that. Again, all these sort of ways in which there's a sense that Xi Jinping has doubled down on the more statist approach to managing the economy, mercantilism, if we want to use that word, on the both domestic and international fronts, that I think that's in place, and that's part of what that 2025 platform is about. It's interesting to see some of the way in which the Chinese have responded to American concerns and demands on these issues. So I got to go as part of a congressional delegation. We met with in March, and we were very much focused on these issues of the trade discussions. And I got to sort of watch the U.S. Congress people voice their concerns, and then watch the Chinese responses. And I just want to go through those a little bit here. One of them is on this tech transfer side. The Chinese standard response is to say, we've never demanded tech transfer as a government as a matter of policy. Don't you worry about it. We never demanded that. We hear you, but it's never been our policy, and in going forward, we'll ensure that it's not the policy. If that happens, it's because Western firms and Chinese firms do deals that are win-win, and they're mutually beneficial, and that's just their decision. We don't ever demand that as a government. I think that's going to, so they say, we hear you, but it's not a problem. Then another area where we see some similarity is the new FDI law. They had rolled that out. It was presented right when we were there in China that week. And I think that's also clearly there as a demonstration of goodwill on the Chinese side to say, hey, we understand you. We got these issues of market access. We're going to make sure we protect intellectual property through that. No problem. But it's going to take us a while to implement it. We have a legal process here. You've got laws over there in the West too. We've got a legal structure. Even though everyone knows that basically the legal process in China is far less important than the actual administrative application of these things, and that most of the concerns are not about the laws on the books, but about the implementation of them and the sort of regulatory role in which local governments or businesses use those powers rather than purely legalistic mechanisms. But their response is, we got a new law, here it is, and we'll be putting it in place, just give us some time. And then on the question of US demands, but we also hear this in Europe for sure, of structural change. The response on the Chinese side is, what we hear you say when you say structural change is reform, and that's part of our reform and opening process, and we've been committed to that for the last 40 years. We're all about structural change. We love structural change. Thank you for asking. And we'll continue to work with us on that because we think that's really good, and Xi Jinping cares a lot about structural change, and we're going to do more of that. So a lot of this is saying, we hear you, good, we're going to work on that. Thank you for asking. And then I think probably a lot of what's happening in the debates right now, or the standoff between the U.S. and China, is like, well, okay, how do we actually make sure that it's not just this delaying tactic? And I think this is a huge and probably, frankly, non-realistic request on the side of the United States to ask for structural change of some fundamental level. I don't know how the United States would react if China said, we'd like you to have a fundamental structural change in line with our interests. I mean, so this is something that's a big ask. I think that's part of the negotiating strategy, obviously, but to set that up as an expectation is a really difficult one. That said, that's all kind of pessimistic on my part. I, however, think that especially some of in the business community, both in the United States and maybe in Europe, are overly pessimistic about this. Their sense is that Xi Jinping's stance symbolizes the end of economic reform in China, symbolizes the end of any possibility of political change in China, both along more liberal directions. And I think that's premature. I think it's a difficult time for those, especially in China, who would like to see more liberalization of the economy, more opening of market sectors, less reliance on state-owned enterprises, better functioning of markets. More cooperation in terms of multilateral governance along the lines of those that are already out there on things like the environment and others. It's difficult times, but I don't necessarily think that this process is over, and it's really a question of where those drivers might come from in the future. Let me just say a couple words then by conclusion. I think there are a lot of longer term and, for lack of a better word, offensive kinds of considerations that are not being really taken into account in much of this discussion. So a lot of this is defensive shorter term. I've heard critics say that the language of reciprocity, which is very much at the very much the focus of these things, or the language of level playing fields, is the language of those coming from positions of weakness. I do sense a fair amount of whining. And all of that goes to the broader question of what do you do besides just complain about these issues? Because a lot of them bring us back to fundamental questions of what are the strengths of any given country in the long term. And this requires very difficult discussions about what we think of, should you do more planning of your economy? Should you be picking winners in the way China does? Do you assess that China is somehow very effective at that, and therefore you need to do more of the same? Or do you think in the long term China's own interests are not going to be met with that policy and you should stick with your own interest? But then how do you improve your own education system, your own ability to compete in a world where these tech platforms are incredibly important? But those are longer term interests, which I don't see being as identified. And in the short term, we see discussions, important ones, about investment screening, about tariffs, about technology restrictions. But there are these longer term issues of sort of how you want to structure things, including at the global level. And lastly, I would say a place to look for this is in the transatlantic space. Again, I know it's difficult times, questions about NATO's future, the Trump administration saying that maybe China and Japan and Europe should all adopt voluntary export controls on auto parts and such. These are all difficult times, but because of this assessment that there are shared concerns about the challenge that China poses, shared hopes that there might be alternatives to this, and including maybe eventually being able to work with a China that is going down paths that are more aligned with what the United States and many in Europe would want, that I think there's a lot of room both for more academic and policy discussion about where European and American interests coincide. And I think you could have a lot of fruitful dialogue about these very complex issues in that space, and not much is happening now. Maybe we could do more of that here. So I thank you all for coming and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Matt. And I will just start by asking, I mean, there's a narrative in DC which goes something like, well, Trump might be bad and he's a buffoon, but he did some very, very necessary things with China, which Obama definitely did not. How do you see that? Has he done, what has he done that has been good, and what has he done that's been bad? Or
yeah, great question. I mean, that's my optimistic take on it too, that at least we're having some of these discussions now. I just worry that most of them are not taking place very responsibly in the U.S. context, and there's a lot of assumptions being made and not a lot backing them up. So I've written a fair amount about this idea of geoeconomics, issues related to, say, China's debt trap diplomacy, so BRI-related things. And the pushback on the U.S. side is that China's mercantilist. The assumption is China's very effective as a mercantilist, that it's got these policies that are an effort to link financing of infrastructure and investment to influence. And there's very, very little actual data to prove that that's the case. And at least in my own experience on research, say, about China and Venezuela, this is not what has happened. So if you want to understand, if you're concerned about the relationship China has with Venezuela, you need to understand the drivers of that relationship before you can have an effective response. And to say that China had a plan and purposely did this, what if is the case that China actually misassessed that relationship? There was a politics to it. There were all kinds of incentives. That requires a very different process, and I don't see that happening. So I think some of the discussions are healthy, but at least the jump to judgment and politicized judgment is something that worries me a great deal. And the idea of all of this, I think a lot of the issues are reasonable, like to point out market access issues, IPR issues. We've known about them for a long time. They are reasonable. These security concerns, many of them are reasonable. As a package and as a politicized package, I worry that they could lead the United States and potentially others down a road of confrontation that is difficult to come back from. And I think many in China are asking themselves, does the United States now think of us in a fundamentally different way whereby we are an adversary or an enemy? And if so, what is China's response going to be?
No, and that's also the other thing. It sounds almost like an afterthought from Western policymakers. You spoke about the recent paradigm being strategic competition. Well, the one before that was really, the more we trade, the more we open up, the more we integrate China, the less all problem will be, and especially in times of the economic crisis where we needed the Chinese money. So it seems that it was as much us driving the situation we have today by thinking that this will both increase our wealth and transform China into a flourishing democracy. Is that?
I think that's, that kind of goes back to what I was saying about that fundamental tension between the logic of engagement and the logic of pushback. And I think if what we are seeing now in the Trump administration and with some echoes from some in Europe that everyone needs to wake up, and I think Macron said, the end of naivete, right? This, like, let's stop being stupid and wake up, and we're the leaders to do it. If that's the emphasis now, that's kind of extreme at one end, and kind of saying, in some cases, some in the Trump administration saying that everyone who came before us, Republicans and Democrats alike, have misassessed this or coddled China, and we're here to protect America's true interests. Those are fighting words in a sense of basically saying that we need a fundamental change, and our national interests have been undermined in the past. I think there will be, depending on who may come next, whether it's in the Republican administration or in a Democratic one, I think you might have more of a balance between these, saying, sure, we're now going to make sure that all these engagement side of things is balanced with more of the security and risk side of things, but let's not completely throw all of those out. And I don't know where that leaves us in terms of, say, WTO negotiations. What about environmental issues at a global level? This was a pillar of engagement with China in terms of multilateral governance, but also a strength of the United States when it came to energy relations. That is nowhere to be seen in this current structure. So I think there's a possibility of saying, yes, we can have this more cautious approach on some dimensions, but let's not throw out all of these others. And maybe that brings you back into a TPP conversation. And you can have discussions about human rights. You can have discussions about values, and you can do some business, and you can protect your interests. I think at least I have some hope that maybe that discussion broadens out. But you could imagine it also going down a path where you sort of have more and more of where we're headed now, where it's just much more of a zero-sum kind of relationship.
We need a policy that can do both. Let's open the floor for Q&As. Anders.
Thank you very much. What are the actual things we can do? One of the questions that always rises in terms of China is that our dependency is quite large on China, and also the Chinese response is very often very, very dramatic. We have
Right. Yeah.
For example, in Beijing, and China reacts almost irrationally in the sense that, in terms of Swedish public opinion, they have their ambassador doing funny things here and so on. But what can we do if we want to stop being stupid more concretely?
Well, so I'm not sure I buy the narrative of anyone being stupid, first of all. I'm sort of not convinced of of that in the first place. But I do think, like say on investment screening, the discussion I had this morning had a number of other experts too talking about the technical details of that. And the EU obviously has a new platform in place for that, and now it's going to sort of go to the member states about how they're going to do that. So I think that's one of those sort of practical elements where I think it makes some sense to think about what that's going to be. I think there are concerns about practical or mechanical aspects of that are really important, and also political ones. So how do you decide what's a strategic sector, say, of the economy, or do you limit it to things like critical infrastructure? What do you think is your critical infrastructure? I think this becomes probably even more challenging at the level of high technology companies. So if Ericsson's going to do certain deals, or how do you want to deal with important companies in the tech sector like that? But I think just having a process whereby you have a national discussion about what this is going to be and how you're going to relate to China is one starting point. But what you're talking about is also a broader political issue. Obviously, that's been a topic here, certainly one in Norway as well. And I think this is also really hard because China has set a precedent now with the Norway relationship, whereby if you do something that really upsets them politically, you're going to be in the deep freeze. And then what does that do to your economic interests that you have there? What if that gives China more reason than less to try to undermine your interests, say in the Arctic or something like that? So that is a tough one. How do you abide by your own principles in a context where China might react that way? I think the only way to do this, and it's easier said than done, at least for Sweden and EU members, is to act as much as possible in concert. And I think that matters on the investment screening side of things. So you don't want to have major loopholes there. And there's a lot of interconnectivity among companies as well. So how do you make sure you have a sort of effective EU-wide process where there aren't gaps, where companies on the Chinese side that you, or for wherever, that you deem to be of concern, like where they can't exploit those. And then how do you act more as one on some of these principal issues, so that bullying of a smaller country is something that China's going to have to deal with the whole EU.
But I mean, it is quite a lot of distance from the present situation to that. I mean, Italy just sort of left the club in terms of many of the things.
Yeah.
And so Europe is split.
Yeah.
Concretely, Britain, for example, in the UOA case, have another kind of assessment than the US. Do you think that is a way forward? They have put out, as far as I understand, UOA from the core of the 5G network,
Yeah.
but accepted the idea of UOA. In Sweden, we have sold to companies dealing with semiconductors to China, and they have a lack of semiconductors, so it's contrary to our strategic interests. And this is just something we did without a public debate. So, I mean, where do you think that balance is? The British way something we could copy, or what do you think?
Well, I imagine there's others of you here who know far more about the 5G Huawei technical issues. I think the one thing I can say about this is I think that, first of all, there's going to be more than less of these situations where European countries find themselves in between the US and China on an issue, and that's not a comfortable situation to be in. So how do you sort of think about what those might be and try to mitigate those, and again, hopefully act as the EU, but it's easier said than done. So there's that, and then there's the question of whether or not Huawei, it's a technical issue partly, of whether that's true. Can you separate the core from the periphery in a way? I don't have an opinion about that. I don't understand that enough. I do think there's got to be some room for reasonable difference of views on this, in the sense that different countries may assess their own security risk, if they do it in a thoughtful way, somewhat differently. But I don't think that's going to be something the U.S. current government is going to accept. And the problem with it is that it's an immediate issue. It's like much of this infrastructure is already there. There's cost issues. Some can afford it more than others.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, to summarize the Swedish position, I think it's very much what you said, the Norwegian case. I mean, we are Norway, we're one of the most open economies, especially high-tech, especially kind of dual use as semiconductors, etc. And China owning a couple of large companies, but also trying to buy critical infrastructure, etc. I mean, we are, the short answer, we're as exposed as Norway, and that will be a sort of Damocles over Swedish government.
Yeah.
And also with the growth pace, I mean, the way the Chinese economy is growing and the way they need to spend it abroad, and the way our economy is not growing, that's really what worries me. But let's Viking had a.
Yes, thank you. So you talked about the reassessment and all this.
Yeah.
To me, it seems like at the bottom of this sort of lies a concern about Europe's growing dependency on China. And so I wanted to have your take on that. Is dependency in itself, in the sense that we trade more, take more investment, a danger? Or is there, does there have to be something else for us to be subject to Chinese influence? And what is that extra thing in that case?
No, that's a great question. I don't see Europe as being dependent on China. I think that there's certain interdependencies for sure. When I think of dependency kinds of relationships, I think a little bit more of, say, South America, where there's this real, sort of like the only thing, it's a very narrow kind of relationship where all they do is export commodities to China. I think this comes down to like how we define and measure things like influence. And I think that's what you'd want to get into with that. And I think you're going to find that there are these different levels of interdependence and then you kind of have to measure whether or not you think that, say, having sold these chip companies or something is something that is then going to undermine Swedish interests. I generally don't feel like this right now. I mean, China is increasingly a major player in investment in Europe, and obviously we've seen that it's gone down a little bit in the last couple of years overall for the EU, but Sweden has gone up. But there's far more investment from elsewhere in the EU or the United States. So it's relative to what is the other question. So I don't feel like there's a dependency at this point. And when I think about this in comparative terms, like who is most interdependent with China economically, commercially? It's countries in Southeast Asia, its neighbors. And how do they deal with this? You also have small countries, like everyone's small relative to China. And I think this goes back to my point about whining. I hear a lot of concerns about, like on the business side of things and about concerns about influence. I mean, go to Taiwan and talk about investment and influence and all this. And life is not easy for them, but they deal with it day in and day out in a way that I think isn't as much about the whining. Yes, they would like some more support, but I think there may be some practical ways of learning from countries in Southeast Asia also about how they manage some of these questions of investment and influence. I'm not sure that answers your question. I feel like a lot of what's going on in these broad questions or concerns about, say, influence is that we have very few definitions of what that would be, and I think we need to start with some more careful definitions of it, and also then ways of measuring it. And if you're concerned about it, once you've done that, then you put in place certain policies. But I think a lot of what's happening is a lack of definition and a lack of measurement.
But wouldn't it work on, so let's see, Europe's relation to China is not Belarus' relation to Russia, but then in certain sectors, you take the Portuguese telecom sector, you have 85%, something like that, Chinese owned. And then you see Portugal working against EU screening mechanisms.
Yep.
I mean, wouldn't that be a critical dependency, potentially impacting Portuguese foreign policy and EU foreign policy and EU unity?
Yeah, I think those are the concerns about the sort of way in which you can get access in certain countries and then that their policies are going to undermine EU unity. But I think, again, I think this kind of comes to, I think you have to get into the details. Is Portugal acting like that because of that relationship? So I did a project last year where I looked at Serbia and Hungary and the Chinese finance railway there. And the question we were asking was, what's the relationship between influence and investment there? And what I saw a lot of in both Hungary and Serbia was people saying, you know what, we're not all that happy with this railway deal. We don't like the idea of China not having any of the risk and us having all the risk. Much of the EU discussion about the way in which China was able to effectively kind of divide and rule in Europe was focused on Hungary's behavior and Greece's behavior. But if you look at it, there's a lot of discontent with some of those projects. The whole 16+1 structure seems to be, like many of the countries in that, are reassessing the relationship with China. And the EU has been alerted to some of these concerns and then has acted. So it's not to diminish that issue, but I think this is now kind of on the radar screen. But I think you're exactly right. There's going to be variation across countries, and where China can get more of this kind of access to some of these sectors where it thinks it might have some leverage, it'll certainly do it.
Yeah. More questions? Carl?
Right, so just a quick question on the internal political dimension of recent elections. So you mentioned this, that Xi Jinping has now abolished the term limits, which would make him much more susceptible to criticism from within the Communist Party. Do you think that there's any chance that with US trade tensions, with skepticism from Europe, and in general more global scrutiny of Chinese foreign policy, that there might be a return to more collective leadership because there is no Xi Jinping, or is that maybe a bit optimistic?
Well, I don't see any return to this immediately, but I do think that there is I think a couple of aspects of what Xi Jinping has done are deeply risky for China itself. Just this idea that you would change the dynamics from this sort of consensual leadership structure and a regularized change in leadership. Like who's supposed to come next? What are the incentives, like the enemies you create as a result of doing all this are there? But it seems to me to create a much more brittle system where the risks are extremely high. I think some of the reasons why he's done this is to try to institute a new kind of discipline within the party and within the whole structure of government, but it's a very high risk effort, and we just don't know where this is going to go. What do you have after him if you don't have this sort of more consensual kind of leadership? So I think it's deeply risky. And then I think the corollary of this on the foreign policy front is the BRI. I think there are a variety of things that are done that are just extremely risky. Like, why do it like that? I don't understand, other than as a kind of political vanity project that kind of fits in with his also domestic strategy of taking so many of these levers of control for himself. But it's deeply, deeply risky. Why it's like most of what was happening with the BRI was already happening. The ideas behind it, the way the institutions that were part of it were already there, and now you have this new, very high-profile project, which a lot of people obviously are piling in on in terms of their criticism of, again, kind of high risk, high reward sort of thing. So I see a mirroring of that at both levels, which has ushered in, to me, a level of risk. But obviously, he and his support group thought these risks were worth it.
More questions? Viking?
Okay. So the reason, if I can come back to dependency again. So the reason I asked the question is we've done a bit, if you look at Italy, for example, where China really acquired influence by them signing this MOU despite the United States campaign to say that they shouldn't. Italy is not dependent on China, specifically with trade and investment.
Yeah.
So then it would have to be something else. I think that's the case with Hungary as well.
I mean, why do it?
Yeah, why do it? And I mean, there are a few other factors that come up. Then in all these countries where China seems to have gained influence, the governments have been Eurosceptic almost every time. Also, there's not really been a public discussion about China. So I'm wondering, what do you see as the real factors behind Chinese influence if it's not trade and investment? Because to me it seems like these existing projects, it doesn't seem that they're very important for Chinese influence. It's more the hope that China will bring new investments, that this will help the country.
Mhm.
In Italy, that was the case, for example. This Geraci, they wanted to sort of restart the economy.
So I guess I'd go back to the influence thing, and I'm still a little in part because of the project I did last year. I think we came away. So we did 4 case studies. I did this with a couple of co-authors. I did the Serbia-Hungary one, and another did the Greek case, and then another did two Dutch ones. And we basically came away quite skeptical of the idea that China really got much influence at all. And that in the Hungary case, the one I worked on, that was like the paradigm of China doing this railway project, working with Orban, undercutting EU positions on China and South China Sea and human rights and stuff. And I actually, in my discussions, again, I think that influence had a real limit. First of all, there's very little Chinese investment in Hungary. Germany is a far bigger player. Orban is doing what he wants to do in terms of a relationship with China and with the EU. Out of, like, China's a minor consideration in that whole approach to domestic governance and Hungary's relationship with the EU. So to say that China is in some way influencing that, I think, is largely a misperception. And then, like I said, there are all these people who I spoke to, some of whom were in positions of influence in Hungary, who were quite unhappy with that direction, and there was a reaction against it. So this is just one example of, like, saying, well, what do we mean by the influence? Maybe, I think the term influence itself has almost been politicized to be able to say, oh, you're influenced by China as this. Then, you know, in the Italy case, you're asking sort of some of these drivers, and I think a lot of it does come back to domestic politics within Italy itself. What did they actually get out of that, too? So on that same trip, the Chinese also visited France. A lot bigger deals were signed with France. France didn't sign a BRI MOU. So there's this symbolic element to it as well. I'm not sure that all adds up. Like, does China now have influence over Italy, or did Italy make a sort of symbolic effort, maybe in the hopes of doing some more deal making, maybe politicians grandstanding to show others within the competition they have within Italy or elsewhere in the EU, something? China almost comes away from this as, like, being not the most important element of this. I think you can also look to other comparative examples. I've been asking myself some of this in the context of the Caribbean and Central America, where you've seen a flurry of these BRI MOUs signed. And they're playing a risky game there because the United States is watching closely and is worried about these BRI agreements. So then there's a kind of question of what are the costs, the perceived costs and benefits from any country that decides it's going to do something like sign a Belt and Road agreement. There's these symbolic elements, and then for countries that feel that they're in need of more support, or they want to get the attention, say, of the EU or the United States, maybe they do it to sort of, you know, poke them. Maybe that gives China levers of influence, but
yeah, I mean, coming from a war studies background, I see, I mean, the similar mechanics as compellence and deterrence. I mean, compellence, you're trying to tell someone to do something, whereas deterrence, you're trying to make someone not do anything.
Oh.
So knowing when deterrence works is really difficult. Well, unless something doesn't happen, but you don't know if it doesn't happen because you made something.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the fundamental dynamics with Chinese investments. I mean, if China would point their hand and say, do this, then you probably might go for one-off. You use your opportunity to influence, and then everybody will securitize it even more.
Yep.
But the one where states are abstaining from acting from themselves, where, okay, we are practically owned, our telecom business is owned by China, let's not upset China. That's very, very hard to measure.
Yeah.
This is just in my head. But so last question, here in Sweden are working on a China strategy, and let's say you're running a think tank in Sweden and you're gonna critically review this China strategy. What would you hope to see, and what would you don't hope to see? What would you, you know, as a China expert, what will be the key pillars for China strategy, and what would you really would not want to see in that? I know it's a big question, but you can take you can take your favorite parts of it.
Boy, what would I?
If a China strategy is possible in the first place, but that's maybe another discussion in a published form.
Well, I think I would want to start with some of these very kind of concrete issues of, sort of, first of all, trying to get a real assessment of what is China's position. So like some of these very practical issues of like, how do you know where China's got investments in this, that, and the other sector, where areas where you're worried about, say, chip companies selling, like just identifying these areas which are maybe not all that controversial, just like doing a collecting of data where maybe now it's kind of dispersed or something, and then kind of working your way up to some of these bigger issues, including things that are a balance between defensive measures and the longer term kind of offensive or strengthening sorts of things. And I think that no matter what plan Sweden itself may come up with, it's got to be part of a group effort. An interesting document in this regard is the BDI report from the German, it's the commercial group, and it's kind of like their Chamber of Commerce, and they did a report in January which factored in heavily, I think, to the European Commission white paper. But they have really good discussion in there about what they think German strengths are economically, commercially, but also in terms of values and cooperation. And they said, and asking whether or not this China challenge is something that is going to change those values or how they can sort of strengthen them both as Germany and then within the EU. So I think that is one of the most interesting discussions about, like, do we want to go down a road that's actually more about industrial planning? And they say, well, no, but we want to strengthen things like education and job training and all of these things that are going to make us competitive in the future, but we can't do it just as Germany, we got to do it as Europe. And I would think some of those same discussions would be relevant here.
It definitely would. Well, please join me to thank Matt with a warm applause for a good discussion.